Welcome to the GETI 2026 Intelligence Briefing from EventSAR Advisory. Today, we're unpacking the Great Divide, which is a core piece of the 105 Report Global Event Tourism Index. For the senior executives tuning in, we are looking at a stark, undeniable 2028 reality, and it's this. Intuition-based event tourism strategies are now entirely obsolete. Think about how long this industry has relied on gut feeling and historical reputation to forecast demand.
It's been the default playbook for decades, right? But the global landscape has completely fractured. We assess 255 nations and territories across 3 composite layers, 9 dimensions, and 15 event categories. The data is clear. If your destination strategy relies on legacy positioning rather than targeted, dimensional capability, you're operating completely blind.
And here is the immediate provocation from our baseline assessment. The EventSAR Global Event Tourism Index Gini coefficient currently sits at 0.67.
To put that number into perspective, for those of you advising tourism ministries, the global income Gini coefficient is hovering around 0.55. That means event tourism readiness is structurally more unequal than global wealth itself. When you look at the sheer scale of the $1.1 trillion event economy, it's actually staggering to realize how hyper-concentrated those capital flows really are. Access to that trillion-dollar market is heavily restricted by massive addressable infrastructure deficits.
Let's contextualize what that inequality actually looks like in the aggregate. We are looking at a massive 67-point capability gap across our scoring tiers. The A-tier nations are averaging a score of 79.39, while the E-tier average totally collapses down to 12.34. What this essentially tells us is that roughly 60% of global event revenue flows directly to just the 21 nations occupying that A-tier. By 2030, destinations that ignore this structural reality and failed to close specific infrastructure and policy gaps are going to face severe international capital starvation. Imagine a legacy European destination, one with decades of rich hosting history, suddenly losing a massive medical congress bid simply because they can't match the dedicated 5G and frictionless transit infrastructure of an emerging A-tier competitor. That's the new reality we are facing. Let's dissect how nations actually secure that top tier by looking at the capital pathway. The United Arab Emirates achieved A-tier status with a GETI score of 78.58 and a venue and physical infrastructure, or VPI, score of 71.7.
And they certainly didn't achieve this through passive organic growth. The UAE executed an unprecedented feat of deliberate engineering. They effectively compressed what typically takes a century of physical infrastructure development into 35 years of concentrated sovereign wealth deployment. The sheer magnitude of that compression culminated in an $8.5 billion investment catalyst for Expo 2020, permanently locking in their high-yield hosting capabilities on a global scale.
So what is the core strategic lesson here for CBB directors and tourism ministers? Competing against A-tier capital requires adopting these exact Layer 3 compounding mathematics to justify any large-scale infrastructure bids you're planning.
Exactly. Layer 3 represents the compounding return of combining physical readiness with proven event delivery. If you are going to your finance ministry to ask for funding, you absolutely have to prove multiplicative returns. The math works like this. The new mega venue attracts the global congress, which subsequently attracts the regional corporate headquarters of those exhibitors, which then builds the local talent pool, and that ultimately generates entirely new domestic events. It's an aggressive compounding ecosystem.
And if we map this trajectory out, the window for catching up is closing incredibly fast. By the 2028 to 2030 cycle, investment-led A-tier nations are projected to lock up 70% of premium international event tourism congresses. That is a regional event monopoly in the making. We really need to let that term land. A regional event monopoly. Once a destination establishes comprehensive, flawless capability across all 9 events-year dimensions, the market allocates resources to them by default. It becomes an unassailable flywheel, securing permanent A-tier dominance that older legacy markets will seriously struggle to disrupt. But keep in mind, it isn't strictly about pouring concrete. When we bridge to the underlying structural forces driving these scores, digital readiness and innovation, what we refer to as DRI, explains a staggering 71% of the variance between tiers. This is probably the most critical operational finding for anyone running a destination portfolio. Forecasting to 2028, digital deployment yields a 10-to-1 cost efficiency over physical concrete. It is incredibly frustrating to see DMOs obsessing over massive physical convention center expansions when their downtown cores still lack seamless citywide 5G or modern digital payment ecosystems. Deploying that digital infrastructure costs a fraction of building a new mega venue, but it accelerates your tier mobility far faster because it dramatically increases your visibility to international event allocators. We actually see this efficiency in action when we unpack the policy premium. Look at Rwanda. They secured B-tier achievement with a GETI score of 58.18.
What's truly remarkable here is their overperformance against traditional economic metrics. Rwanda beat their modest $14.1 billion GDP prediction by a massive 23.2 points. They executed this via aggressive governance reforms, a highly targeted aviation expansion featuring Rwanda Air strategic routing, and a highly specific $300 million investment in the Kigali Convention Center, which they built as a definitive statement to the global market.
We need to speak directly to national tourism organizations right now. Rwanda proves that deliberate policy interventions can systematically bypass standard economic timelines.
Absolutely. You can artificially accelerate a destination's tier mobility. It is essentially a cheat code for global positioning. You don't need to wait for passive economic growth or a trillion-dollar economy. Focused policy, streamlined governance, and targeted capital deployment will forcefully position you on the global event tourism map.
When looking at the trajectory for these proactive B-tier nations, the 2028 to 2030 outlook is highly aggressive. Reform-led B-tier nations are already moving to intercept and capture high-yield event tourism demand. Frankly, they are eating the lunch of their complacent legacy neighbors who are stubbornly resting on their historical laurels. These reformers are fast approaching the B-plus threshold because they actively target specific dimensional deficits, closing those gaps years before legacy markets even update their RFPs.
Unfortunately, there is a very stark contrast at the bottom of the index. We have identified 82 nations trapped below a GTI score of 35. We call this the structural exclusion zone. By 2028, these destinations will be entirely invisible to digital-first site selection. And let's be super clear about why they are invisible. It is a literal algorithmic exclusion. With nearly 80% of international event site selection now occurring through digital discovery, AI site selection tools and procurement algorithms simply filter these low digital readiness destinations out long before a human planner ever even sees them.
Yet, for investors, this exclusion zone masks incredible raw potential. Let's introduce the Mauritania archetype. Mauritania shows a massive negative 34.76-point gap between their Layer 1 infrastructure and Layer 2 events. This is a crucial metric for us. A negative L1, L2 gap signifies that robust, proven cultural demand is already happening on the ground, but it is entirely unmatched by physical infrastructure. Take Mauritania's Festival of Ancient Cities. Thousands of people gather. The cultural capital is immense. The demand is undeniably there. But the formal systems, the premium hospitality beds, the dedicated venues needed to monetize those gatherings are entirely missing. This is the ultimate demand signal lesson for hospitality investors and infrastructure funds. When Layer 2 cultural resilience dramatically outpaces Layer 1 infrastructure, it categorically proves local demand exists. This is the holy grail for an infrastructure fund. You aren't building a convention center in a vacuum and gambling on future demand. You are just capturing the overflow of what's already happening right now. It radically lowers the risk profile for physical infrastructure capital because you are simply providing the hardware to formalize and capture the economic value of intense, pre-existing cultural activity. The 2028 to 2030 outlook for these gap markets is basically a ruthless race for first-mover advantage. Organizers and developers who are reading these demand signals now will aggressively capture these territories.
For sure. They'll deploy first-mover infrastructure and realize those Layer 3 compound gains long before these nations formally complete their Tier C to B transitions. And the reality is stark. By the time the generalized economic data catches up to the reality on the ground, the smart money has already packed up and gone home.
Moving into our synthesis, the event CR, GETI data, makes one thing clear. Structural shifts dictate winners. Let's synthesize the 2030 strategic outlook into 3 clear takeaways. 1. Digital-first capital deployment offers the absolute highest ROI. 2. Exploiting the L1, L2 gap minimizes investment risk. 3. Both of these lead to compounding Layer 3 gains. Synthesizing the data from across the entire index, this structural shift heavily favors digital readiness and governance interventions over legacy market positioning. Like we said, historical reputation is no longer enough to secure premium events.
And that's the real danger going into 2030. Destinations that refuse to address their specific dimensional deficits are going to permanently cede market share. Complacent A and B-plus tier legacy markets are incredibly vulnerable right now. They just assume their historic pipeline is safe, while agile B-tier reformers are using this exact three-step playbook to completely outmaneuver them on the global stage.
This brings us to how you actually apply these insights. Event Zur Advisory works directly with destinations, tourism boards, and investors to turn this intelligence into competitive strategy.
Let me be as direct as possible. If you are making hosting, investment, or positioning decisions without this depth of dimensional data, you're working with an incomplete picture. Intuition does not secure $300 million infrastructure investments. Precise, quantified capability mapping does.
We partner with convention bureaus, national tourism organizations, and event associations to co-create intelligence. You can start this process with us today at eventsazr.com/advisory. Remember, this has been just one of 105 GETI 2026 briefings. We strongly encourage you to share this with a colleague or finance minister who needs to hear this analysis. This has been a GETI 2026 intelligence briefing from Event AZR. Make decisions with data, not intuition.